Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. We're delighted to be learning today with a great scholar and leader, and with all of you. And our topic today, as you know, is what's a nice Jewish girl like you doing in a place like this? Jews, prison, and spirituality. And we're delighted to be here today with Dr. Elaine Leeder. Elaine Leeder is a professor emerita of sociology and the dean emerita of the School of Social Sciences at Sonoma State University. Previously, she was a professor at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. She has 48 years of distinguished accomplishments and experience in academia and public service. She's listed in Who's Who of America Women, Who's Who in America, and Who's Who in American Teachers. Her awards include a National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship, Visiting Scholar status at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Outstanding Teacher Awards, Research and Travel Grants, and numerous awards from student and community agencies. She's a co-founder of the Jewish Studies Program and the producer of the Holocaust and Genocide Memorial Grove and the Anne Frank Tree Installation at Sonoma State University. Leeder has an MSW from Yeshiva University, an MPH from University of California at Berkeley, and a PhD from Cornell University, has published 6 books and numerous articles. Her book, The Family and Global Perspective, A Gendered Journey, is based on her semester at Sea Voyages in 1992, 99, and 2013. One of her books, My Life with Lifers, Lessons for a Teacher, Humanity Has No Bars, describes her work in prisons in New York and California, where she taught, ran groups, and now does victim-offender dialogues. Her exemplary career encompasses roles as professor, teacher, psychotherapist, consultant, author, and advocate for social justice. You can visit her at elaineleeder.com. Friends, thank you so much for being here. And Dr. Leeder, passing it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Shmuley. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I always say that bio just means that I'm old. And you know how you just rack things up when you're old. So, and right now I'm sitting, I know you're in 110-degree weather, and I'm sitting in Berkeley where it is 64 degrees, and I'm in a cashmere sweater, so because I'm so cold. Anyway, so I'm about to launch into a discussion about my work in prisons, and I'm going to tell you why I do it and what the joy of it is and how it relates to being Jewish, because it's very much a part of our Jewish heritage to be working with people who are as marginalized as prisoners. Often we drive by prisons and we don't think of the people inside, and believe it or not, there are many Jews inside. And my motto as I teach is prisoners are people too. And most of them get there for very good reasons that some of us would have ended up in prison had we had the experiences that these people have. And so I'm going to sort of walk you through my learning about working in prisons. And I'm an audience participation teacher, so we're going to stop at various points. You can ask me some questions, and then we'll have more questions and answers at the end. So why am I working in prisons? This all began, I would say, because my father was a Holocaust refugee. He came out of, his family was killed in the Holocaust by bullets in Kupiškis, Lithuania. He made it out in 1939, but my house I was brought up with a lot of darkness. And I really wanted to understand, as I began to get older, how could people commit evil? How could such a thing like the Holocaust happen? And also, how do we try to grapple with people who commit evil so that maybe we can intervene in some way? So what I did was I realized along the way that much of my work in prisons is really based on having been brought up in what was an Orthodox home. And so there's a lot of the values of tzedek and chesed and caring for the strangers. And it was imbued in my body. I don't know that I identified it as Jewish until later, but it really has informed everything that I have ever done. I'm a warrior for social justice based on my life experience with my family. I was a professor at Ithaca College in upstate New York, where it is always cold, by the way. Whenever you're hot, you can assume it's below zero and gray. My experience was that I was teaching in a summer school, and some high school kids came up from New York City. We had to take them on a tour, and one of them said, "Can we go to a prison?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" So just down the road, about an hour, was Elmira Correctional Facility. That's the slide on the picture on the left. And we had a tour. And then I said to the warden, "Do you have any education in here?" And he said, "Well, we have GED." And I said, "Well, would you like higher education?" And the warden said, "Well, sure, if you're offering it." So I went back to my provost, chief academic officer, and I said, "Look, I will go down there once a week, and I'll teach a course that I teach at Ithaca College, which was Introduction to Sociology. And I'll do it for free if you will give the guys who are registered in my class credit." Provost said, "Sure, it's not going to cost us anything. We just put them on the books and give them 3 units of credit, and they can leave prison having had some college education." So the rest is history. That was 1995, and I've been in prison ever since. What's that now? It's almost 30 years. So I've been at it a while. I've been to prisons all over California, not as many in New York. So what happened was, after I taught the class for a couple of years, and the program is still going on, I left to become a dean at Sonoma State in Northern California. And then within one semester, I really missed the prison. And let me tell you, people always say, "Well, aren't you afraid?" My first couple of weeks at Elmira, it was quite amazing to me, because there was an altercation in the yard below where the classroom was. And the guys all said to me, "Don't you worry, Elaine, we're not going to let anything happen to you. We are thrilled that you're here." I have never had a negative experience in all those years in prison with the prisoners. Sometimes the correction officers don't like me very much and give me a hard time as I get in, as they want you and want to know why you're there. And, it depends on the prison, but the prisoners themselves are really grateful to be treated like students, like normal human beings. So I get to California in 2001, and one semester goes by, and I was really missing prison. And so I understood there was a college program, it was called Patton University, and I volunteered to teach for them once a week. But that became a big ordeal for me, working full time, driving an hour to the prison. And eventually the guys who had been in my class says, asked me if I would run a group. So they formed a group called Self-Help, and was it New Leaf on Life. And I became the facilitator, bringing in college professors and psychologists and lawyers, and ways to educate the prisoners about various aspects. One time I brought in a physicist who was trying to explain to the inmates about black holes. And she started to say something about microwaves. And at the time, microwaves were not allowed in prison. She had to rethink her whole way of teaching about technology, because these guys had no technology whatsoever, including a microwave in the prison. And everyone I brought in said it was a transformative experience. Students, I used to bring students in, and they just adored it. They said that the men inside treated them more respectfully than people out on the streets. These were often young co-eds who had been hooted at and grabbed at as they're being adorable out in public. These men were respectful and non-sexualized, and just thrilled that they were there. The professors that I brought in told me that the experience teaching was remarkable because the students were so receptive to the information. And in fact, most of my students said that they really were thrilled to be in classes because now their time in their cells was spent studying rather than wasting time or being out in the yard working out. So the experience really started to utilize their brains rather than their brawn and started to help them switch their thinking about what got them all into prison. And I'm going to get to that. Finally, eventually, what I did was I moved into victim offender dialogues. I wanted something more deep. I didn't want to be a psychotherapist, but I wanted to bring people together, the victims of the crimes and the perpetrators of the crime, in a restorative justice process. And so I'm going to talk about that as I go through my talks, because that's where the most profound examples of Jewish spirituality take place. So I already told you about my first experiences. And let me say, every time I go, I was in San Quentin last Wednesday night for dinner. It was a program that was called Quentin Cooks. And it was a chef program to teach the guys how to become chefs once they're released. The food was fabulous. I mean, could have been a 5-star restaurant. The only thing was they had not yet learned about hospitality, so it wasn't very elegant in its presentation, but the food was quite good. And my experiences in prison have been quite transformative, both for me and for the prisoners that I have worked with. I find myself often being with people, I'm a Jewish girl from Boston. What am I doing hanging out with men with tats and swastikas and, people who grew up in inner cities and people who are immigrants from countries whose languages I do not speak. I'm a cross-cultural traveler when I walk into a prison. You don't have to go far away. You don't have to travel far to be working in a prison because the experiences are rich in terms of the learning you have. I've had Fijian students and Samoan students and people from the Mexican mafia and neo-Nazis all in my class. And we sit there and we talk to each other like mensches, human beings. So my experience is, I know it all sounds Pollyanna, but believe me, it's remarkable what happens. And I don't have words enough, but I will describe some of the experiences as we go on later, and you'll see how fabulous it is. Next slide. So as a result of my experiences in San Quentin and Elmira, I wrote a book called My Life with Lifers, Lessons for a Teacher, Humanity Has No Bars. I think it's still in print. I think it's $10. You don't have to read it. This talk is the essence of it. But it really, I was able to write it in one summer because it just kind of poured out of me. And I quite love the cover. I think it really is provocative and evocative of, a teacher going behind bars. The only thing is, I think the hand should be either black or brown and not white. So I'm going to focus first on Jews in prison, and then I'm going to, in general, prisoners and restorative justice. But interestingly, of the 1.9 million people in prison, Jews are only 0.1%. And we do understand that it's 32% of incarcerated people are people of color. I mean, there is the trajectory of being in poor schools, getting a rotten education, or having trauma and early childhood events that lead you to prison, as well as the racism and the criminal injustice system. So for Jews, we're a rarity. Only about 50,000 of us in prison, and most of them are there for white-collar crimes, although I'm going to tell you about a couple of men, Jewish men, who were in for more violent crimes. But there have been Jewish criminals since the time began, and since we've been in this country. I talk fast, you can tell, I'm from the East Coast. So there's Dutch Schultz from the Mafia, who was a murderer, and Bugsy Siegel from bootlegging. And at one point, I was actually going to write a book on Jews in prison, and I was going to go through the historical evidence of how many of us land up in prison for violent crimes. And now, of course, we know about Bernie Madoff and Michael Cohen as not very good examples of Jews in prison. I have a little story about Bernie Madoff that's interesting. I knew some people who were incarcerated with him in New York State. And, when all of his money was taken when he was incarcerated to pay back the people that he built. But he was able to make money in prison because he would give stock tips to the prisoners, who then would invest tell their families on the outside to do these investments. And then he would get some money back when the investments paid off. So he was able to build up money in the commissary, which is how guys get money on their books, it's called, so they can go to the canteen or the commissary and get top ramen or juice or skin cream. And so Bernie parlayed his financial brilliance even once he was behind bars. So we don't like the idea of Jewish criminals, right? It gives us a bad name. And we're afraid of anti-Semitism. I mean, anti-Semitism is bad enough. And then you get somebody like Bernie or Michael Cohen in the news, and how if it's the question always is it good for the Jews? Well, these guys don't make it good for us out in public. We're afraid of the anti-Semitism, and Bernie Madoff made us all look bad because it sort of plays into the Jews as shysters, you'll pardon the language, which I heard used yesterday. And I bristled when somebody said it because it provokes the stereotypes of Jews and Sherlock and Bernie Madoff. Jews in prison have a very hard time, particularly if they try to practice or show their religion. Some prisons are better than others. I'll say at San Quentin, there's a Jewish chaplain. Jewish men can wear tzitzis and talit and wear their yarmulkes because it's more open to diversity in religious practice. But some of the prisons are really filled with skinheads and anti-Semites, and so some people do have to hide it. It's very hard in some prisons also to get kosher foods. It depends on the state and on the prison. I was mentioning to Rabbi Shmuley that there's a rabbi down in Tucson. His name is Reuven Barkin, and he works with Jewish prisoners there. And again, I met with some of them when I was there recently, and they all told me it was really hard to be a Jew in prison in Arizona. There's not a lot of support systems in place. It's hard to keep Shabbat. It's hard to keep the holidays. And so some people just go underground until they can practice in public, maybe once they get out, or they do it totally in private. Very, excuse me, interestingly, I once met the chaplain at San Quentin when there was a death row, which has since been dismantled. And she told me at the time, was a female chaplain, that she used to go up and do Shabbos on death row for the several Jewish inmates who were on death row. What I like to do is to humanize the people that I'm talking about. Let me just take a sip of water. So I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite prisoners. His name was Yohanan. By the way, all of the names that I use are whatever that word is for made up, right? My brain has just gone blank. So I was there for his bar mitzvah at San Quentin, which I have to say was probably one of the most moving experiences. I'd also been there because he later, Yohanan ran a Passover Seder that was, and when you get to this part of let my people go, I mean, it's particularly poignant, right? Because there they are behind bars and they have to get back to their cells for count by 8 o'clock. And so it was really quite touching to me to be at the bar mitzvah, and he did a beautiful job. He wore his yarmulke on the yard. He also wore his tzitzis. He davened every morning. Now, this was a young man when I met him. He was probably in his 40s, I think, maybe early 50s, who had been born in LA to two Jewish parents, father from LA and mother from Rochester. And this is a picture of him, and you can see the yarmulke, and you can't see the tzitzis, but he was a fabulous artist. And his work was shown. There was an arts and correction. His work was sold at the San Quentin handicrafts shop because he was so very talented. Now, his story was very painful, and this is what the gist of my talk, if you want, what did Elaine teach you today, is hurt people hurt people. And you've probably heard that phrase before. Hurt people hurt people. Everyone that I have ever met in prison has some early childhood something that scarred them deeply if they committed the crime. I have definitely met people who did not commit the crime and will say up to 20, 30 years later, I didn't do the crime. But for those who admit it and you go back into their lives, you find that, I don't like the word only trauma, I would say severe emotional or physical abuse that has taken place in their lives. So here's Yohanan's story. He was abused. He stuttered because he was afraid a lot, and his father hated him for it, couldn't tolerate it. He was called dumb and stupid, even though he was a fabulous drummer, painter, and drawer. And he was not brought up Jewish, but one day he knew he was Jewish, both his parents were, and he was walking by out of elementary school, and he went past a shul, and this was before the gates, and the voices were coming from the windows, and he was drawn to it. So he went in, and he joined the service, and his grandfather had been Jewish and had also shown him a little bit about the rituals. And so he joined this shul as a little kid, and they kind of adopted him and mentored him. And he loved his Judaism. He really felt like he'd come home. But his mother bought a Christmas tree by the time he was 9, calling it a Hanukkah bush. And his older siblings also started to use drugs and alcohol. The house became a flop house for hippies, and he lived in fear of the alcoholic father. So he had quite a lot of ugliness in his upbringing. Here's some of his work again. Every piece of work that we have by him has a bird, and the bird is because they can fly over the walls and be free. And so I love his work. Next slide, because of the symbolism. So not only did his father beat him up and his mother turning away from Judaism, but his caretaker began to sexually assault him as well. So we have physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual assault, all before the age of 12. And then he went to live with his mother's relatives who had converted, as mother had, to Mormonism and Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he said there was no more Jewish business for me. I had to go to church and to seminary. Then his father, who had left the family, brought him home, and then he had to go to work for his school, for his dad. And the step siblings hated him. And listen to this. He was injected with LSD twice while he was sleeping. So we're talking about a young man who didn't know any kindness or love except from his Judaism. And by the time he was, and his stepbrother used him as target practice for a BB gun. So, of course, he would end up having trouble. So he began to express his anger, looking for fights, and then he was a vandal. He said, I was filled with rage. At home, he was quiet and demure and a stutterer, but in public, he was a troublemaker. Started to break windows. He ran away from home. He lived with his grandparents. He got his own apartment. By the time he was about 18, he was already in the California Youth Authority for 3.5 years for armed robbery with a gun. He was on the downward slope. And by the time he got out, he was a ticking time bomb. In his early 20s, because this kid was smart, right? He had a good head on his shoulders. He became a paralegal and was starting to pull himself out of it. And he said he wanted to have a family. So he met a woman who had a child, an 18-month-old, and he had no modeling for normal, healthy parenting. So she left him one, let me just say, he also was very rageful. Whenever things didn't go his way, he would just act out. And he was with this woman, and she left him one night, and the child was crying and shrieking and was not the kid he was expecting to have in a family. He wanted a family like he didn't have. And he shook the kid. And this is where it gets horrible. He shook the kid and he threw the kid against the wall, and the child died. And he was prosecuted for murder, more from inside prison. By the way, look at the car. That was the last car he had seen. It was probably from the 1950s or 60s, right? Before he got in, 1970s maybe. So he told the police he had wanted to be in a family, but the child kept rejecting him. He said, I destroyed his life and everyone connected to him. The world changed, my world changed, her world changed, my family, my life. Devastated. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. And that's where he began his work on finding his Judaism again. And he spent 32 years of his life doing Teshuvah, which was truly repentance from the heart, true change, transformation of Teshuvah. He said, what I've learned in prison is that everyone has value, a spark of divine goodness, a neshama, that spark of holiness that obligates me to treat everyone with love and dignity. So I had known him in prison. This would have been in the 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around 2004. He was released. When I met him, by the way, he had said to me, Elaine, I never deserved to get out of prison. I killed a child. But in prison, he was a model person. He would intervene if there were fights in the yard. He would do whatever he could to do good there. And people began to see him as a good neshama. Eventually, he went before the parole board, and because of all of his good behavior, they told him they threw him out of prison basically after 32 years. But he'd done a long time inside. He got out in his late 50s. He got out, and then I went down. He got out to LA, and I met him when I was down there. And this is what he told me. He said he was out standing on a street corner with his yarmulke and his tzitzis, and a woman drives by and sees him standing there. He'd recently been released. She turns her car around. She follows him. She starts to talk to him, and she's the daughter of a rabbi. She takes him to the shul. They embrace him, of course, because he's just a lovely guy. And they get married. And he gets a job, given his artistic abilities, in an art store, teaching, giving supplies and giving lessons, selling supplies, giving lessons. But recently, because I've been doing this talk, I looked him up online, and he died of cancer very soon after. Probably he was out about 8 or 9 years and then died of cancer. So it's just a tragic, tragic story, but tells you about the trajectory of how it is that folks end up inside. And I've had prisoners who have described to me, Black prisoners who said, oh, I've been called the N-word for most of my life. And other people who tell me that they were beaten as children or given a gun because they were trained to be street warriors. Or I had one Latino man who told me, oh yeah, my brother was a priest and I was not very good in school and I wasn't a very, I didn't have my act together, and anything in the gangs asked me to join, and I wanted to be a member of something, so I joined. And then when they wanted a volunteer to do the first shooting, I raised my hand because I wanted to belong. And then when the second shooting came along, I volunteered again because I wanted to prove I was the biggest, baddest dude in this gang. And so, but if you trace it, and let me say, I am not condoning this behavior. You shouldn't be killing people. We all know that. But hurt people, and this is how they get there. And we have to be intervening far more early than we do in prison. And so that's why I tell these stories, so that we can humanize it. There's one of the last pictures that he painted, again, beautiful. And a really interesting story is I gave this talk in Berkeley about a year ago, and there was a man there who knew him, used to send him Judaica in prison. And Yohanan had given this bookstore owner a very beautiful piece of a lithograph. And they gave it to me, and it was a picture of a man with a tallis over his head and bars, and the prayer for the word in Hebrew for prayer, and then ani, me. And now I have that in my house to remember Yohanan. So I want to stop right there, and then I'm going to go on to other people, but I want to make sure that we have time. So any questions thus far about what I've been saying, or any comments?
Sorry, I think there was a question from Elizabeth.
Oh, good. Elizabeth,
less a question than a deep appreciation for all your sharing and a recognition. I worked in a prison for about 3.5 years, and I was deeply touched by the whole experience. So it's just wonderful to hear you speaking all of this.
So this resonates with you, what you experienced as well? Yeah. Every time people go in, they come out with that experience. It's like you get hooked. You got to keep going back. It's the best work I've ever done. And I've been a professor and a therapist, and I've had a good life, but this is the capstone of my career, to be able to do something like this. And I want you to do it. That's why I'm doing these talks. So maybe something will grab you. And I have some next steps if you're interested. Here are two more of my Jewish colleagues. On the left, my friend Marvin. He was, when I went to San Quentin the first time, the warden was a woman, and she introduced me to him, a Jewish guy. His mother was a Holocaust survivor. And the warden introduced me to the mayor of San Quentin. And I said, no, you're the mayor. And she said, no, he's the mayor, because he would go around and talk to people and then go to the guards or to the warden and negotiate, things like staying out in the yard for an extra half hour or getting an extra ration in the canteen. The other guy, and by the way, he got in a lot of trouble and once got the tiers, just like you've seen in movies, a tier of cells and another tier of cells, like a cake, but of cell blocks. And one day he alienated somebody and he got tossed off the top tier and ended up at the bottom, and many bones broken, and he had to go into protective custody. Eventually he got out. This man, by the way, did not commit his crime. He was exonerated by an Innocence Project, and there's a movie about him because he attested for the whole time I knew him, I think he was in for 42 years, that he did not do it. And it was proven that he did not do it. The guy on the right is an African-American Jew who practices his Judaism. He was in for crimes that, he never gave me permission to tell, so I can't. Marvin, I could tell because he didn't do it. These guys are both out right now and doing extremely well and still being very Jewish in their practices as well as their identity. And both of them are working with ex-felons. Marvin is on a California Commission for Hospice in the prisons, setting up hospice programs, and the other guy is working in reentry programs for prisoners who are getting out. So my experience, and this actually follows a model that Maimonides believed in. There's a wonderful book by Dana Ruttenberg called Repentance and Repair. And she takes Maimonides' teaching and put it into a same framework. And in fact, I need to add that to my slides. But my friend John Irwin, who was a professor at San Francisco State, did time for armed robbery, got out, got a PhD, and worked with prisoners. And he said there's a 4-stage process in which people change when they're inside. And let me say, I don't believe everybody in prison changes. I would say maybe 90% of them eventually come to some form of redemption, not want to ever see on the streets. People who are sociopaths, people with multiple murders, that sort of stuff, no redemption done. So I'm not of the mind that everyone should be out, but my experience is that most people go through this, and it takes a while. It doesn't happen in the first couple of years of being in prison. But the stages are awakening, where you begin to realize that what you have done has profound impact on other people. And you can almost know when somebody gets it, because if they're telling you, well, I caught a case, catching a case is like catching a cold. It comes at you. But if you say, I did a crime, that's taking responsibility. And so the awakening is just saying, yeah, I did something that caused harm to people. Then there's programming, which is, some prisons have wonderful programs. San Quentin has 3,000 volunteers, canine companions and gardens and, education and religion and et cetera, but many prisons, like the one I went to in Tucson, has very little programming. Sometimes you can do AA or NA or, Al-Anon, but often those exist in prison. And so you can do that, or you can do it on your own. Many people find religion inside, all kinds of religions. I have one friend who goes in and he teaches Yoruba religion out of Nigeria. And so there's all kinds of ways of transforming oneself that is not always cognitive. It can be spiritual and emotional. But after programming comes atonement. And atonement is when you begin to really suffer for what you've done and really begin to make changes in your behavior in prison, as well as how you deal with people on the outside. And the atonement, I'm working with a man right now he got life without parole plus 11 years, a Black man who is living in Pelican Bay, which is the most notorious prison in California, 24/7 lockup. He's creating a program now for youth to come into the prison once a month. And he's atoning for a crime he didn't commit, but he feels that he wants youth to understand what it's like to be in prison. And it's not a scared straight, it's more like a mentoring program. So atoning, I have people who I've worked with who do hospice work, or they mentor young, tough guys who are just coming into prison, and atoning by being a guide or a mentor and helping them change their behaviors. So there's all kinds of ways of being atoning. And then comes redemption. Redemption can be writing a letter to your victim. It can be a sense of your own fulfillment of having transformed yourself. I've watched healing circles with men who committed murders in which they are crying in each other's arms about what they have done, forgiving each other, and having empathy for how they got there. Hurt people hurt people. And so they talk about how they were hurt. And many of these people were victims too. And then they go on to victimize out of the rage that they feel from their own victimization. So it's a transformative process. It's redemption and repair that takes place, even in prison. So now I want to talk about my restorative justice process. I think we have about 15 minutes, so I think I can get through it and we can have discussion. So restorative justice is what I'm doing now, and it's seeing crime as an act against the victim, but it shifts the focus to repairing the harm rather than punishing. So it's away from the punishment model and more into the healing model. And it says that the harm has been committed not only against the victim's family, and the community that surrounds them. So it believes that the offender needs to be helped and to identify what they need to change to prevent further offending. So it's a more of a holistic approach. You know, what happens when you go to court is the DA takes the case and the defender, public defender or the lawyer takes the case, and it's adversarial. They want to win or lose. With a restorative justice process, you're equals in the process. And you sit in a circle, and I'll tell you about some of the cases in which you talk about the harm that was caused and the consequences of the harm, and then why one committed the harm. What was it that led up to it? What happened in their experience? Why did they do it? What were they thinking? My first case, this brought tears to my eyes. A woman asked the man who killed her daughter, "What did my daughter say as she lay dying?" Can you imagine? I mean, that broke my heart. I was present, you know, and he told her. And then she wanted to know, well, what did you do with the murder weapon? We never found it. And he told her. These are all things that never came out in court, because if he dared to speak of it, he would get more time. And so, in fact, defenders tell you, do not turn around and look at the families, because it'll push their buttons and it'll be more adversarial. So as much as they might want in those moments to turn around and say how horrified it is by the crime, they're not allowed to. And the victims can only read victim impact statements. There's no dialogue. So I want to tell you about some of my cases, because this is where the rubber meets the road, and it's where I learned so much. The very first case was one in which it was a DWI case, driving while intoxicated. And the young man had been in prison 20 years. The young woman had been in the car coming home from her bridal shower. Her mother and her sister were in the car. She was driving. A head-on collision on the passenger side, so her mother and her sister were on the side. They died instantly. She was in the hospital for a very long time. She put off her marriage. She was healing. She finally got married, I think, after almost 8 to 9 years after the incident. She had children. She got herself a real estate license. She got herself together. The young man had been given 20 years, and because he was now, he had really programmed quite a bit in prison, was going to get out in 20 years. And they lived in the same community. They'd gone to the same high school. And she wanted to meet him before he came back to this small little town in the Central Valley of California. So we walk into this room, and I think I might have had a prep session. Usually you prep 6 months with each side, or 3 to 6 months, so that there's really a chance to vent and figure out what you want to say and get honest and go back. And, you know, I mean, it's not therapy, but it's deep understanding of everything surrounding the incident on both sides. So you do that. And I only had one session with each of them, and I brought them together, and they fell into each other's arms crying. They had known each other in high school. I was surprised at that. And then they sort of talked about, well, how has prison been for you and how have you been since the accident? And then he says to her, I don't know who your sister and mother were. Tell me about them. So she spends about 20 minutes talking about who they were. And then he says, I'm getting out in a couple of days. I would like to visit their graves, bring some flowers. Will you come with me? And she said, yes. And then he says, and this is all like a couple of hours, I'm really condensing. He says, there is nothing I can ever do to make up for what I have done. And she said, oh, yes, there is. You will come with me on the circuit and we will go to high schools and talk about driving while intoxicated. And they're now out talking in the Central Valley at high schools to other kids about drugs. So there is, you can't ever, I don't like the word closure. I think that word is misused. How do you get closure when your daughter dies, right? You don't. But what you get from these is you have been separate, you come together, and you move forward together. Or maybe you don't move it forward together, but you have answers so that you in some way can move further along in the process of what you've been going through. I'll tell you about another case. This was a kidnapping case, and so far it was 3 armed men who break into a house, keep a mother and a daughter captive overnight, put the daughter in a closet, tie her up, and put dynamite on her back, and then keep the mother at gunpoint, take her the next day to the bank where she is the bank manager, force her to open up the vault and steal the money. And then they let her go. She runs back to her daughter. It was not dynamite, it was fake dynamite. But they were traumatized. Needless to say, they moved out of their house. They had to go into therapy. Things were pretty awful for a number of years after that. The guys were found almost immediately because they had left a bunch of symbols or signs, clues to who they were. They were arrested immediately. And in their defense, the 3 defense attorneys put their heads together and said, let's implicate the woman. Let's say that she orchestrated the crime, the woman who was kidnapped, the bank manager. So not only was she kidnapped and forced to rob, she was then in the courtroom the defense was that she had been part of the crime. So she was triply victimized, if not more so. It was discovered, in fact, that she did not, but she had a reputation to live down after that. So fast forward almost 20 years later, and all the 3 guys are in prison. They're moving on. The child is now in her early 30s. And the woman seeks this process. And in California, the way you do it is you contact victim services through the California Department of Corrections, and you say, I want a dialogue with the offender. And then we get I have a contract, and we go out and we meet with both parties, and then we bring them together. And so we go to the prison. First, I meet with the victims and hear their story. Then we go to the prison. And let me tell you, I've now done probably 25 of these. I've only had 2 prisoners ever deny not wanting to do this. Both of them were sex offenders. Neither of them wanted to cop to their crimes. All the others, murderers, kidnappers, all kinds of other crimes, armed robbery, have cried or been so moved that people wanted to participate in this process that they definitely do so. So in this case, we met with first one of the men, and it was on Zoom during COVID. And the young child, who's now in her early 30s, gets on, and the man says to her, I'm really sorry I ruined your childhood. And she said, oh, you didn't ruin my childhood. A few years later, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and I was prepared for that trauma, given what happened with you. You were merely a speed bump in my life, and I'm fine with it. And, they did the Zoom dialogue. And then 2 weeks later was his first parole hearing. They both got on to the parole board and said, let this man out. We know that he is redeemed. We're speaking on his behalf. And he got out on his first parole hearing, which was very unusual. You usually don't get out on your first parole hearing. A year later, after parole, he did get out. We then went in person to Southern California with usually you have support people present. So there was the woman, the daughter, and the woman's brother who had been sort of helping them during the crisis. There was the man who did the kidnapping, his mother and his sister, myself, my co-facilitator, and a parole officer. There were like 9 of us in the room. And the woman brought a plant for the kidnapper's mother. There was a benediction because there were religious people in the room. They each talked about the consequences of the crime, and he talked about why he did it. And the mother of the man who did it wept. She was a very small woman from Mexico, and she wept and said, I never raised my child to do this. I'm so sorry. I apologize. The mothers embraced. I mean, I was crying, to be honest with you, in this event. And then it went on for 3 hours. No, I'm sorry. That one was 6 hours. They can go anywhere from 3 to 8 hours. Sometimes we even do them in 2 days in a row or follow up a couple of months later. And they're now communicating without us, and they're now talking about doing a podcast together from a victim's perspective and from the perpetrator of a crime's perspective. By the way, if you've not ever heard the podcast Ear Hustle, I would like to recommend it to you. Ear Hustle, it's a fabulous podcast about life inside prison. And it's by people who've been in prison, interviewing people in prison, mothers and daughters and cellmates. And, how do you have sex if you're on a visitation and there's no place to have, all kinds of inside scoop about what life is like in prison. So I would recommend Ear Hustle. Next slide. I'm moving quickly because I only have 4 more minutes. This is what it looks like. We sit in a circle in all kinds of rooms. I've been locked in cells doing this, and you do it wherever you can do it because it's what happens when you're working in prisons. Ear hustle, EAR hustle. And so why is this similar to being Jewish? Because all human beings have value. We can return to our original purity of Teshuvah, about loving kindness and compassion, and that justice is necessary. Rabbi Schneerson, I happen to be distantly related to, and so Chabad, by the way, has been often sponsoring me in these talks because I really believe in the transformative power of Teshuvah. And so, he says in his writings that you can't reach your highest potential in prison. And I would agree with them. I often say that it's not just through the criminal justice system. I call it an injustice system because of the social and political and economic inequities and racial. That all human beings are unique, that we have to be careful in our words, and we must care for the stranger. And there are organizations, if you want to do this kind of work. There's the Aleph Institute, and you can just Google aleph.ne.org. And you can bring Passover or Jewish culture and learning to prisons. I believe your Rabbi Shmuley is involved with prisons, so he certainly can point you in the right direction. There's Lubavitch outreach all over the world, as a matter of fact. And we all believe that every Jew and every human being has a neshama, and the spark, and that it can be dulled, but it can be rekindled. Even inside, we can free them spiritually, if not physically. Jewish Prisoner Services, jpsi.org, if you're interested. And then, of course, there's the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society, who helps sponsor my talks. They're a Hasidic organization, Lubavitch. I'm not Lubavitch, but they leave me alone and they tell me I can go on the circuit and tell you about all of this. Conclusion, it's the best work I've ever done in my life. Finding Jews in prison is like, it's Hamish, if you know the Yiddish word, it's Hamish. They're Landsleit, you know, they're family. And they're just like us. They're not the most awful thing they have ever done. Do you want to be known for the most awful thing you have ever done? I sure don't. And then I urge you to get involved in any way you might choose. I've become an abolitionist. I really don't believe that the criminal justice system as it exists today in the United States is viable, but it's not going to be destroyed in my lifetime. But I would urge you, if you're interested in this, look at Finland, look at Norway. They have a much more humane way of dealing with people who have committed crimes. Next slide. And here I am. You can get me at ElaineLeeder.com or at my sonoma.edu address. Whew, I made it on it to 2 o'clock. So how about some questions or comments? And Elizabeth, thank you. I'm really grateful for your comment. Anybody? Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Just one observation I had is, in my experience, that people who were just had a year-long sentence or a couple of year sentences with the work that I went in to do had very little interest. They spent a lot of time in fantasy of what it was going to be like when they got out, whereas I was teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction. And whereas the people who were lifers or who had extended sentences were very highly motivated.
I completely concur. And I've only been working with the long timers. Yeah. The newbies, as you say, the 1 or 2 years, they figure, oh, I'm just doing my time and I'm out of here. They don't have to transform. But the hardcore, they're more ready for it, I think. How about others? Anybody? And it is ear hustle, EAR, hustle, HUSTLE. Any comments or feedback? If you have no questions, I'd like to hear if you learned anything. No? All right.
Is it Julie?
Yes.
Julie, hi.
Thank you. It was excellent. I learned quite a bit how it is. And from hearing this, I learned about this. I'm just fascinated by the reform, the justice reform that goes on. I wonder how widespread that is throughout the penal system, at large.
The restorative justice is just getting started in prisons. It's a Native American concept. It's existed in indigenous cultures forever. Healing circles, where you put person who did the harm into their community and talk about why'd you do it and how can we fix it. So it goes far back. People are not using it in prison. I have been proposing it when I was in New Mexico. I proposed it at some forum and I've marketed it. Some places in New York are using it, California. I don't think that New Mexico or Arizona are. I have a friend in New Mexico who's trying to bring it into prisons. It needs more publicity. And it needs more inculcation. There's a prison, the San Quentin has now become a rehabilitation center rather than a penitentiary. In your state, it's still a penitentiary, lock them up. So there's a lot of work, and it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but that's why I'm on the circuit. I want you all to hear about it, and anywhere you can plant a seed, who show this video and, let it catch like fire. Mm-hmm. So, thank you for your comments, Julie.
Absolutely. Yes. And I will say, I'm familiar with Beit Teshuvah. I'm sure you are,
Yes.
Yes.
I know her, actually, Harriet.
Yes. Marvelous book, marvelous writer. And so they're doing a great work. And, I just wonder, for someone who's not a professional, what can we do? who's
Well, let me tell you, you don't have to be a professional to go into prisons. You could go contact Reuven Barkin. I'm a mentor for him, the chaplain in Tucson. Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz knows him, and say, "Can I volunteer?" Maybe you don't want to go down to Tucson, but are you up in Scottsdale?
well, even more north, more north.
All right. Well, he might be able to tell you what there is in your area, because he has brought it to the Tucson prisons. So you don't need to be a professional to do this. You might need to be trained in how to do this, but there are training programs. Just type it. There's a program in California called Ahimsa. That's who I work for, AHIMSA. There's a program called RJOY, RJOY, and they do it. You can learn it in a couple of weeks. The process is not rocket science. It's a lot of listening.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, Julie. How about others?
I just I would like to thank you so much for giving this great talk. It was so interesting and educational, and we are so glad to have you with us today. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here with us today.